Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today is April 13th, 2026, and that means it is the 165th anniversary of the surrender of Fort Sumter in the first action of the American Civil War. Now, this is a topic that everybody knows a little bit something about, especially if you've studied American history, but you might not know a lot of the details. So I thought that would be a good topic to dive into today, and we're going to use our friends over at the American Battlefield Trust to do that. It's been a while since we've taken a look at one of their videos, but if you've been around this channel long, you know that they are friends of me personally, but of this channel. I have incredible respect and admiration for their work and for the people who work there, the men and women, many of whom have become friends over the last few years. And I'm proud to be a financial supporter of the American Battlefield Trust myself. And I'd encourage you to do that if you're looking for a charity to donate to. So we're going to dive into this one. I'll put the link down in the description. This is the animated battle map of Fort Sumter. It's going to give a little bit of the background, and we'll dive into some of the details here, some things you may not know about. There was a lot going on in the background while all of this was unfolding. While the firing is going on, there had been a lot of negotiations at different levels and in different places. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that. Hope you'll join me for the journey. I just want to give a shout out and a thank you to Jackson Hufford, who is one of our supporters on Patreon. Thank you, Jackson, for your support. Couldn't do it without you. Let's dive in.
Even before the Civil War, the nation was divided, North and South. Slavery was at the heart of issues involving economics, politics, and sectional power. These issues boiled over in the halls of Congress, at Harper's Ferry, and elsewhere. The slave labor of the agricultural South was the fuel that drove the region's economy. The industrial North was driven by a manufacturing-based economy. This diversity helped fan the flames of secession.
And this is all stuff that traces its roots to the American Revolution. You know, there's a big difference in terms of the view of government and the view of the nature of the society that they were hoping to create. Men like Thomas Jefferson are very much about a agrarian, a rural society in which men farm their land and they support themselves, and they don't rely on banks and on loans and on industry and things like that. But this is also the world of the later stages of the Industrial Revolution, and so the North is very much at the heart of that. And this also goes to kind of a difference in terms of the people that were settling these areas, right? In the northern United States, you have a lot of German immigrants, you have the Dutch, you have English immigrants, and these are all places where there's a lot of industry going on, right? But in the South, you have a lot of Scots-Irish as well. You know, Scots-Irish is a particularly unique American term, but basically what you have are a lot of people who came from either Scotland or from Ulster, what is now Northern Ireland. They're called Scots-Irish because they were Scottish descent, but they settled in Ireland and then came from Ireland. You also have Irish immigrants settling in places like New York, but those Scots-Irish are very rural. They're in many cases farmers. They have a distrust for strong central governments, and that all builds up in this, as well as, of course, the invention of the cotton gin, which makes cotton and other cash crops more valuable. The cotton gin makes it much more profitable to have a plantation with a lot of slaves.
Have significant impact upon the coming war. The presidential election of 1860 proved to be the final spark that tore the country apart. Nominees Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge represented the North and South respectively. The Constitutional Union Party sent...
So in this case, what we're dealing with is John Breckinridge, who is the sitting vice president, youngest vice president in American history, who is from Kentucky. You have Stephen Douglas from Illinois, and they split the Democratic Party. You have the Northern Democrats supporting Douglas, Southern Democrats supporting Breckinridge. You have John Bell, whose running mate is Edward Everett, who will give the long speech before the very short one that Lincoln gives at Gettysburg a few years later. And of course, you have Abraham Lincoln, who is only the second ever nominee for the brand new Republican Party to run, and he's the first successful one.
John Bell is their candidate, with Abraham Lincoln as the Republican Party's nominee. Lincoln's anti-slavery views were seen by many Southerners as a direct threat to their way of life.
It's important to note that the Republicans and Lincoln himself are not campaigning as anti-slavery. There are definitely anti-slavery components or abolitionist components. Lincoln certainly opposes slavery, but he's not advocating for ending it. He doesn't think that's politically even possible at that time in 1860. But he does oppose the expansion of slavery, and that's something that one of the key things the Republican Party is founded on. And in the South, they see cutting off expansion to slavery as tantamount to its eventual death, and that they will not tolerate.
Therefore, when Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, Southern states were outraged. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 6 other states soon followed, forming the Confederate States of America.
And these are the Deep South, or what they call the Cotton States sometimes. These are the states that are most heavily dependent on the institution of slavery for their economies. So it makes sense that they go first. Charleston is where, like, probably half of all the slaves who have ever been imported to the United States, at least, have come through. And so they're at the heart of all of this.
With the Union dissolved, civil war was inevitable. By March 1861, nearly all the forts and naval yards in the Second States had been seized by the new government. Charleston Harbor was among a handful of coastal strongholds that remained in federal possession.
So let's talk a little bit about this. A lot of these forts, especially on the eastern seaboard all the way up to Maine, places like Fort Knox in Maine, these are forts that are built in the early part of the 19th century, just to help protect the United States against, let's say we have another war of 1812, right? We have another war with the British, or a war with the French, or a war with the Spanish. So you want to protect your harbors. You want to build strong fortifications. And Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, is one of those forts that gets built, along with Fort Moultrie, which actually Fort Moultrie is built in a spot where there had been fortifications all the way back to the Revolutionary War. You have Fort Pinckney there as well.
When South Carolina seceded from the Union, there were 3 U.S. fortifications in Charleston Harbor. Castle Pinckney was built in 1810 to provide for inner harbor defense. By 1860, it was in need of major repair, and its garrison consisted of only 2 people, a widowed sergeant and his teenage daughter.
If you go there today, you'll see that it's a really tiny area, and one thing that's misleading about Charleston Harbor, check out, if you get a chance, a map of the depth of Charleston Harbor. Because even though it looks pretty wide, there's actually only a narrow channel through which heavier ships can actually go, because it's very narrow. It's very shallow. In fact, the part where Fort Sumter is built is man-made land that at low tide, you can actually walk out to Fort Sumter. You don't even need a boat. At high tide, it's completely surrounded by water. So it's very, very shallow over in here. So there's just this narrow channel, and they understood that, and so that informed how they built these forts. And eventually, if you're familiar with Glory and Battery Wagner, that's going to be built over here on this tip, just a further fortification that was built by the Confederates.
Fort Moultrie, first built in 1776, with succeeding forts built on the same site, was completed in 1809. With 50 cannon mounted, it served as the major fortification to defend Charleston Harbor until the...
And that's a key, right? Fort Moultrie, this area is kind of a swampy area, and Fort Moultrie is really neat to visit if you get the chance. But it was built to defend the harbor. That means its strong fortifications and most of its guns are facing south. They're facing south and east toward the water. It's not built to protect from land. And that's going to become a key factor in all this.
The beginning of the war. Fort Sumter was an imposing sight. Sitting on a man-made island, the brick fort was 90% complete in 1860 and the most defensible fortification in Charleston Harbor. In November 1860, Major Robert Anderson assumed command of U.S. fortifications in Charleston Harbor, headquartered at Fort Moultrie. Soon after South Carolina seceded, Major Anderson moved his command of 85 officers and men to Fort Sumter, under cover of darkness.
Yeah, why did he do that? Because at this point, South Carolina is claiming to be a sovereign nation, and you have Charleston militia in the area, and he's looking at his fort and thinking, I can't defend this against a land attack. And so he basically gives his men like an hour notice in late December, I think it's right around Christmas, and says, we're moving out in an hour and we're going to Fort Sumter. And so they load on the boats and they hightail it to the much easier to defend fort in the center of the harbor.
Fort Sumter was the safest and most defensible position he could hold against attack with a limited number of men and supplies at hand.
He's got less than 100.
Charlestonians were outraged, and within a few days, South Carolina militia had seized all federal property in the area except Fort Sumter. They occupied Castle Pinckney and seized Fort Moultrie. In defiance of the federal presence in Charleston Harbor, the Southerners rebuilt batteries and constructed new fortifications on Sullivan's Island, on Morris Island, and on James Island.
Yeah, and on James Island, I think it's called Fort Johnson. This is where the first shots are going to be fired from. And there you have the eventual site of that famous battle at the end of Glory by the 54th Massachusetts and others who marched up there. It's unfortunately, a lot of it's underwater now, and you can't really visit the site.
When Anderson and his troops first entered Fort Sumter, the fort was far from complete. For 3 months, Anderson prepared Fort Sumter for combat. By April 12th, however, fewer than half the needed cannon were ready, and even these lacked soldiers to man them.
So while all this is going on, there's a lot of negotiations going on. Abraham Lincoln doesn't become president. Back then, Inauguration Day was in March, not in January like it is now. And so Abraham Lincoln doesn't become president until March. And so his first task, as soon as he becomes president, is to try and deal with this Fort Sumter issue and to try and keep these remaining states from seceding. States like North Carolina, Virginia especially, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Arkansas. So he's talking a lot of backroom deals. He's making gestures. He outright, very publicly offers that he's willing to withdraw Anderson's garrison from Fort Sumter in exchange for guarantees from Virginia that they will not secede. And they just won't do it. And Virginia will eventually secede after Fort Sumter. So they're making these kinds of deals. There had actually been shots fired back in January when Buchanan was still president, when a ship starts to enter Charleston Harbor coming toward Fort Sumter, and Confederate forces actually fire on it. So that had already been going on.
As the Federals strengthened Sumter, Confederate forces could be seen building batteries and mounting cannons along the harbor shore. 43 Southern cannon were trained on Fort Sumter, and more than 3,500 Confederate soldiers manned Charleston Harbor defense.
So this is all a very fascinating case study in diplomacy and negotiation and strategy. If you're Abraham Lincoln, one of the things for him is that he will not recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate government. He sees them as rebels that are claiming to be a government in a part of the United States. And so he won't negotiate directly with the Confederacy in that way. But he is negotiating with state officials and things like that. And they're talking about deals, and they're talking about whether or not to provision the fort. And Lincoln understands that there's a couple of things going on here. He feels like a line in the sand has to be drawn somewhere, and he feels like this is federal property, and we're not going to give up federal property to rebels. But he also understands the optics of being the aggressor, and so he's willing to allow the South to become the aggressor, and he knows that by trying to send food and supplies to this fort, he's potentially baiting them into firing the first shot. So all of that is at play here.
Anderson was running low on provisions, and in January, a federal relief ship left New York with supplies
Star
for
of the
Fort
West.
Sumter. When the Star of the West appeared at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, cadets from Charleston's elite Citadel Military Academy opened fire upon the unarmed ship.
You definitely can argue these are the first shots of the Civil War, right? I mean, we always talk about April 12th, 1861, when Fort Sumter is fired upon, but the Star of the West was fired on first.
Star of the West turned back without reaching the fort. By April of 1861, Major Robert Anderson was in a tight fix. Confederates surrounded Fort Sumter and were expected to attack at any time. To avoid war, the Confederate government ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter, and if refused, to reduce it. His aides visited Fort Sumter twice under flag of truce and presented Anderson with the ultimatum, but without success.
Yeah, so Anderson actually tells them during one of these meetings, the one just hours before the fighting started, he tells them, listen, if I'm not resupplied, then I've only got a couple days left and I'm going to have to pull out of this fort, and then you can have it. And so he tells them, basically comes up with an agreement. He says, if I'm not resupplied by April 15th, I'm withdrawing. But in Beauregard's mind, that wasn't good enough. That was too strict of a demand, because he demanded, you need to evacuate now or we're firing upon you. And Anderson's like, just wait 3 days, and I'm out. But they don't accept that.
At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, a shot fired from Fort Johnson on James Island burst over Fort Sumter and signaled the Confederate batteries in Charleston Harbor to commence an assault on the fort. The Civil War had begun. At daybreak, Union forces opened fire in response. Charlestonians watched as the bombardment of the fort continued for 34 hours.
Can you imagine what a sight that must have been? People who have grown up in Charleston have known about these forts all their lives, and it's all been their country, right? And now they're seeing South Carolinians and others firing on Fort Sumter, and they're seeing with their own eyes the first real shots of the Civil War being fired.
During the second day of the battle, artillery fire from Fort Moultrie set parts of Fort Sumter on fire.
So one of the things I want to just highlight real quick here is if you visit Fort Sumter, and you can, it's a very limited. The only thing, I went there to try and make a video, and you basically get like an hour on the fort because you have to take a boat out, and it leaves from right over by the aircraft carrier that they have there. But I think it's the USS Yorktown, the later Yorktown, not the one that was sunk at the Battle of Midway. But you don't get a lot of time. But anyway, they have a sign there that has a list of the garrison. And one of the things that's really interesting about this garrison is Major Robert Anderson, and then you look at some of these other names, Samuel Wiley Crawford, you've got Abner Doubleday, Jefferson C. Davis, Norman Hall. These are all guys, and there's a few others, I think, too, that become generals in the war. Norman Hall, very famously during the bombardment of Fort Sumter, there's a fire that's raging, and he's trying to protect the American flag. And in the process of climbing up the flagpole to get the flag, he actually has his eyebrows singed off by the fire. Jefferson C. Davis is a Union general who actually murdered another Union general and got away with it because he was a decent general. Norman Hall was one of the guys defending at the center of the Union line during Pickett's charge. Richard K. Meade is an interesting one here because you see he's part of the Union garrison at Fort Sumter. Well, after this, he actually becomes a Confederate officer, and I think dies in 1862 of disease. But it's kind of fascinating because some of these guys are from states that are still in the Union when Fort Sumter happens, but then later become Confederate states. And so some of these guys are actually going to leave after this and will have fought for both sides when you think about it.
With so few men, Anderson could not fight the fire and the Confederates at the same time. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, arrangements were made for Anderson to surrender the fort. On April 14, 1861, after a 50-gun salute to the U.S. flag, Anderson and his men withdrew to New York aboard a Union supply ship.
Yeah, so no Union soldiers died during the bombardment, which ends, in the afternoon of April 13th. But the first fatality of the war is going to happen then during that 50-gun salute, when one of the guns misfires and there's an explosion and causes death. And that, I don't even know his name, but that's really the first death from fire during the Civil War, and it was accidental.
Shortly after, Confederate forces occupied Fort Sumter, with photographers right behind.
And this is unusual because if you think about it, we don't see a tremendous amount of photography taking place among the Confederates other than, studio photography of generals and things like that. You see very few of men in the field. You see very few of situations like this as it happens.
For the next 4 years, Fort Sumter became a symbol.
Yep.
For the South, it was sacred ground, where the first shot in the war for Southern independence was fired. For the North, Fort Sumter symbolized secession and disloyalty. U.S. Navy ships formed a blockade to keep Southern cargo vessels from using Charleston's port. On April 7, 1863, the war returned when 9 Federal gunboats attacked Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. After 2.5 hours, the artillery duel was over.
Yeah, so you see a lot of Monitor-class ships there firing on the fort. And if you go to the fort today, it's you'll see it doesn't look as big and as imposing as it did then because basically the whole top level of the fort is gone and it's only half as high as it used to be.
The Federals without their prize. For the next 20 months...
That's an image there of Robert Gould Shaw dying as he leads the 54th Massachusetts up the parapet and attacking Battery Wagner, and you see the gunboats in the background there.
Union forces bombarded Fort Sumter in an attempt to force surrender. They tried amphibious landings, but without success. Union attacks had a devastating effect upon Fort Sumter, with walls crumbling and cannons dismounted. By late 1863,
look at how badly they've just manhandled that place. Just think about how much artillery was fired at that from big naval guns over the course of a couple of years.
Resembled a giant pile of rubble. Finally, as the war's end neared, Fort Sumter was evacuated. On April 14, 1865, Anderson came out of retirement to raise the U.S. flag once again over Fort Sumter. The war was over.
Well, as always, I want to thank our friends over at the American Battlefield Trust. I want to highly encourage you to consider supporting them, supporting their mission, which is to preserve American battlefields and to use that land then to be able to teach and share that history with every new generation coming up. I want to thank William Dickinson and Ethan Ellis for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much for everything that you do to keep this channel going. See you again soon.